Prosecutors in Greece have frozen all assets of a Greek member of the European Parliament.
Today, the World Cup in Qatar is a proof, actually, of how sports diplomacy can achieve a historical transformation of a country.
She was allegedly caught with bags of cash at her home. Investigators believe this was money she received from Qatar in return for supporting the country in debates at the European Parliament.
Brussels is home to the European Parliament, the glass-paneled building proudly displaying the EU flag. In December 2022, this symbol of European democracy was rocked by a scandal that felt almost cinematic. Belgian police discovered 1.5 million in cash, stuffed into suitcases linked to members of the European Parliament. This became the infamous Qatargate, the biggest corruption scandal in the EU's history. Several MEPs were arrested on the suspicion of taking bribes from Qatar and possibly Morocco to influence legislation and to soften criticism of human rights abuses. Vice presidents lost immunity, police raided offices and homes, and Parliament President Roberto Metsola promised a wide-ranging reform package. But a year later, transparency watchdogs say the EU's ethics system is still wide open to undue influence. Citizens' trust remains shaken, promised reforms were diluted, delayed, or quietly dropped, and many critics now argue that Qatargate wasn't an exception, it was a symptom. In order to understand this case, we need to talk about something that's both completely normal in Brussels and deeply controversial. At its most basic level, lobbying simply means trying to influence political decisions. That's it. No suitcases, no envelopes, no smoky backrooms and dramatic background music. In Brussels, lobbying happens constantly because the European Union regulates almost everything from food safety and chemicals to data privacy, climate policy and artificial intelligence. And the people writing those rules, from commissioners to MEPs to civil servants, they cannot possibly be experts in all of it, so they rely on external input. That input comes from companies, trade unions, NGOs, consumer groups, regional governments, and yes, sometimes foreign actors. It's how EU policymaking is designed to work. But lobbying isn't just about persuasion, it's about access. Who gets in the meeting, who stays, and who gets the follow-up. It's also about who is present when early drafts are written before the public ever sees them. And this is where Qatargate becomes easier to understand, because Qatargate didn't happen instead of lobbying. It happened in the system where lobbying was already normalized. But oversight was weak. Foreign governments didn't invent a new method, they exploited an existing one. Another reason why lobbying works so well is information. EU laws are technical, extremely technical. If a lobbyist arrives with already made amendments, legal expertise, data and impact assessments, while an MEP has 3 staffers juggling 10 policy files, that's not corruption, that's an imbalance. And over time, whoever controls expertise often shapes outcome quietly. There is one more piece of the puzzle. In Brussels, influence doesn't end when someone leaves office. Many former EU officials move directly into lobbying, consultancy, or advisory roles. They know the system, they know the timelines, they know who actually decides. The EU does have cooling off periods on paper. In practice, they are often short, poorly enforced, or easy to bypass. This revolving door doesn't require bribery, it just normalizes proximity between power and money. Most lobbying in Brussels is legal. Qatargate crossed a line because it involved foreign governments using illicit methods, cash payments, covert influence and secret networks, but the tools they used already existed inside the system. These tools are access, relationships, and informal groups. Foreign influence didn't create the vulnerability, it found it, which brings us to what happened next. Because after Qatargate, the European Parliament promised reform. A lot of reform. But before we go further, I would like to encourage you to subscribe to Europe Unpacked. We are currently preparing several other videos on different topics related to Europe, and not just lobbying, but other policies, and we will focus on certain regions in Europe and how their histories shaped their current form. So if you don't want to miss those, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you. After the arrests, the parliament announced a 14-point ethics plan. It sounded serious. stronger whistleblower protections, tighter rules on outside jobs, a ban on unofficial friendship groups on EU countries, the groups that often used as back channels for influence. But when the dust settled, very little changed. The ban on third country friendship groups was dropped entirely. Rules on declaring sponsored travel weren't enforced. 67% of the trips were declared late with no sanctions, and instead of tightening conflict of interest rules, MEPs voted against banning paid side jobs with organizations listed in the EU's lobbying register, meaning that an MEP could legally advise a telecom company while voting on the telecom regulation. Whistleblowers didn't fare much better. Updated internal rules still failed to meet the standards of the EU's own internal whistleblower protection directive. 1 year on, the watchdogs reached a blunt conclusion. Without independent oversight, without external ethics authority, without real sanction, future scandals are extremely likely to happen. Self-policing usually doesn't work, and it doesn't seem to work now either. Qatargate wasn't the only scandal that raised alarms in Brussels. It was followed by something quieter, but in many ways just as revealing.
The allegations against Federica Mogherini could constitute procurement fraud, corruption, conflict of interest, and violation of professional secrecy. That's according to the European Public Prosecutor's Office, which has taken the EU's former foreign policy chief and 2 others into custody.
In late 2025, allegations emerged inside the European External Action Service, or EEAS, the EU's diplomatic arm. The case became known as EEAS-gate. At the center of it was the College of Europe in Bruges, an elite institution often described as the training ground for future EU diplomats, commissioners, and senior officials. The EEAS had awarded a public contract linked to diplomatic training programs at the college. According to internal complaints, the contract may have been rigged. Here's what was alleged. The procurement process, which is supposed to be transparent, competitive, and rules-based, was accused of being manipulated to favor a specific outcome. Staff unions claimed that procurement rules were bypassed, evaluation criteria were adjusted mid-process, and conflicts of interest were not properly addressed. In Brussels, the most powerful decisions often don't happen in plenary votes. They happen before anyone's watching. Between Qatargate and EEAS-gate, a clear picture emerges. It's about systems that rely too heavily on trust, oversight that lacks teeth, and institutions that still police themselves. Transparency groups warn that without independent enforcement, scandals aren't anomalies, they are forecasts. Brussels is home to an estimated 29,000 professional lobbyists with a regular presence near EU institutions. That's roughly 1 lobbyist for every EU official. Over 12,000 organizations are registered to lobby in the EU. Together they declared 1.3 billion in lobbying spending in just 1 year, and that's only what's reported. If Brussels were a city-state, lobbying would be its largest industry. About 2/3 of registered lobbying entities represent business interests. Corporate groups vastly outspend NGOs, trade unions, and civil society organizations combined. One example, the European Chemical Industry Lobby reportedly employs over 160 lobbyists with a budget of 44 million. That's more staff than many public watchdogs have across the entire continent. And simultaneously, that's more budget than a small NGO would ever receive. Imagine an NGO that deals with 44 million on a local issue. For years, the EU took pride in what was called the Brussels effect. Strict European rules on data, chemicals, environment shaped global standards. But lately, critics say the effect has reversed. As economic pressure mounts, Brussels has pivoted toward simplification. Less regulation, faster approvals, fewer constraints, and for corporate lobbyists, this is the perfect environment to thrive in. Industry offices are expanding, think tanks are multiplying, and insiders say corporate access has never been easier. The result? Rules once designed to protect consumers, workers, and the environment are being delayed, diluted, or quietly rewritten. This isn't a conspiracy, it's leverage. But here's the part that often gets missed. Up to this point, everything sounds bleak, and it would be very easy to conclude that lobbying is simply the problem. But that would be dishonest, because lobbying also delivers real, tangible benefits. Many of the EU's strongest protections exist because of lobbying. Worker safety laws, chemical bans, consumer protections, environmental standards. This didn't appear out of nowhere. They were pushed by trade unions, patient groups, environmental NGOs, whistleblowers, and underfunded advocates who refused to disappear without lobbying. Without lobbying, marginalized voices would have almost no access at all. In fact, for many groups, lobbying is the only way to be heard in Brussels. The problem isn't lobbying itself, it's who can afford to do it full time and who can't. So where does that leave us? Banning lobbying isn't realistic, and pretending it's harmless isn't either. The real question is whether the EU can build a system where access is balanced, transparency is mandatory, ethics rules are enforced, and scandals aren't required to trigger reform. Right now, many of the gaps that enabled Qatargate still exist. Loopholes remain, sanctions are rare, oversight is weak. And trust once lost, it's hard to rebuild. Brussels has always been a paradox. It's a beacon of cooperation and a magnet for influence, a place where democracy and deals coexist uneasily. Whether the EU strengthens its defenses or waits for the next scandal to force its hand remains an open question. Because history suggests one thing: institutions rarely change because they want to. They change because they have to. And in Brussels, that usually starts with a scandal.